Hello, you're watching the press preview. It's our first look at what is on the front pages, and it's time to see what's making the headlines tonight with politics editor of gal-dem magazine, Moya Lothian-McClean, and the director of communications at the Institute of Economic Affairs, Annabel Denham. They'll both be with us from now until just before midnight. A very good evening to you. We'll chat in a moment after we've had a look at those front pages for you. Let's start with the Telegraph, leading with the latest warning from President Biden to Russia that if they use chemical weapons in Ukraine, NATO will respond in kind. Actually, also the same lead story on the front of The Guardian. Kiss It Goodbye is the front of the Metro as the daughter of the Russian foreign minister is sanctioned over her luxury London mansion and her bank accounts and assets are frozen. The Mail says the Kremlin has labelled Boris Johnson its #1 enemy after he claimed that Ukraine could actually win the war. Sliding in the FT, leading with the admission to MPs by the boss of P&O Ferries that last week's mass sackings of crew members were illegal, but he'd do it again to save the company. Same lead story for the Mirror with the damning headline, "Shame on you." Here's your Express. It has what it calls 3 stories of despair, people struggling to cope with the cost of living crisis after yesterday's spring statement by the Chancellor. While the Star has the downside of the coming heatwave, a warning that it may be too dangerous for vulnerable people to go outside because of the pollution risk. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch and listen to us. And I'm joined tonight by politics editor of gal-dem magazine, Moya Lothian-McClean, and director of communications at the Institute of Economic Affairs, Annabel Denham. Great to see you both. Thanks for your time this evening. Let's start then, shall we, with the latest on the Ukraine situation. And Moya, the front of the Daily Telegraph, quoting President Biden, "We will respond in kind if Putin uses chemicals." Very clever use of wording. There was a lot of ambiguity. We don't quite know what the red lines are, but it's still a bold statement.
Well, yes. I mean, Biden was responding to a question put directly to him, which said, would you use chemical weapons if Putin used them? So the only thing he could really do to avoid escalation is to use that vague language, I think, frankly. He was at an emergency summit in Brussels of NATO and G7 members where they were discussing the current response to events in Ukraine. What's really interesting about this is what we've seen, and I think also your correspondent touched upon this just before the break, is that the war in Ukraine is not going the way Russia thought it had. They thought it'd be very, very quickly. Instead, we've seen a concerted and determined response from Ukraine. And in fact, now people are starting to say, hang on a minute, maybe Russia won't win this at all. And the questions are rising as to Russia in a desperate position. What will they do next?
Yeah, I mean, Annabel, it certainly did show, didn't it, today, just how unified Western leaders are. NATO really never more united than it was today, and Putin, in fact, getting the very opposite of what he was intending.
Well, yes, of course, just weeks ago, he was hoping and quite succeeding, really, in stoking division between NATO members. If you can remember back that far, there was disagreement over the sorts of sanctions that they would be willing to impose, particularly Germany, reluctant to cease Nord Stream 2, which is now subsequently done. It's increased defence spending. So you're absolutely right that there's a lot more unity among NATO members. My concern is how Vladimir Putin is going to respond to all of this. I thought before he sent tanks into the Ukraine that he was a rational political actor. My worry now is that he's going to think, well, better to be hung for a sheep than for a lamb. You know, is this sort of tough, if ambiguous rhetoric really going to stop him, particularly, as Moya says, when he appears to be on the back foot? The past 4 weeks have put paid to the idea that Ukraine would swiftly capitulate, or Kyiv would even welcome Russian soldiers, Russian tanks. This war is quite clearly not going as Putin planned. It's still not clear how far the West is willing to go, the Western alliance is willing to go in this, but they've, I think, already gone further than I was expecting.
Let's stay with Ukraine, but a different angle. Front page of the Metro. Kiss it goodbye. Jet setter, daughter of an oligarch, has her assets frozen. Tell us a bit about this, Moya.
So yeah, this is the glamorous Polina Kolova. She is the daughter of Svetlana Polakova, who happens to be the unofficial wife of Sergei Lavrov, who is a very high-ranking minister, defense minister in Putin's administration. And she is now one of the latest people with the connections to Russia to have her assets frozen. So she is also prohibited from traveling to or from the UK. And much has been made of Polina, I think, because her life is very documented on Instagram. She's young, she's glamorous, she's somebody that people can sort of seize onto as an example of what happens when these sanctions are applied in real time. But what is quite interesting is she represents the international Russian elite, the people who, well, the West is hoping, will put pressure upon Putin the more these sanctions are applied to them. There was an interesting report in the Times yesterday suggesting if the war and sanctions drag on, top FSB officials are already starting to murmur about turning on Putin because they are very angry at the way so they're called like the new nobility. They're very angry at the sanctions that have been applied to them and the sudden constraints put upon their very elite lives that they've been leading all over the world. So it appears in that sense, sanctions are sowing discontent among the top tier of Russian society.
Yeah, also interesting that we've not seen anything of the Defence Minister and Chief of the General Staff for quite a while now. Lots of questions about what they are up to or what's happened to them. Let's move on from Ukraine then. Take a look at the front of The Guardian. Annabel, the fallout from yesterday. And they say Sunak faces a storm over failure to aid the poorest.
Well, this is just quite extraordinary, really. And I don't think expected from the Chancellor when he sat down at the dispatch box yesterday. I expect that he thought the speech had gone down, the statement had gone down a little better than it has at least 24 hours later. Of course, Rishi Sunak has really cultivated this very slick social media persona. His approval ratings have surpassed those of his neighbour. He's been quite a popular politician, and little wonder, because he's spent an inordinate amount of money, hundreds of billions of pounds, protecting lives and livelihoods. But now the time has come for him to make difficult choices. And as Paul Johnson of the Institute for Fiscal Studies pointed out today, he's really proven to be something of a fiscal illusionist. He's leading us to believe that he's no longer the Augustinian Chancellor, oh Lord, let me be a tax cutter, just not yet. He was trying to impress upon us that he is a low tax Tory, and that the raising of the NICS threshold yesterday and the pledge to lower income tax by 1p in 2024 was indicative of that. But actually, I mean, in a sense, yes, of course, as I mentioned, he did cut taxes, but he's also allowed taxes to rise. He can now expect to raise more in tax as a share of national income by 2025 than he expected last October. The tax burden is a 70-year high. Today, he's been out on the media explaining that there's a limit to how much politicians can magic away. We're facing a cost of living crisis. Inflation is in the high single digits, or at least is expected to be. And of course, we've got soaring energy prices, which is partly because a global phenomenon, although I think that the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee has a lot of questions to answer on that front. And I think that Rishi Sunak's right, ultimately, that there is a limit to how much government is able to protect people from rising prices. But nonetheless, I don't think he's been able to pull the wool over our eyes this time. All
right. Yeah, let's get a quick thought on this from Moya before I ask Moya about P&O. I mean, he has been dealt the worst hand of any chancellor in decades, but has he missed a trick yesterday?
Well, I mean, we're seeing the biggest fall in living standards since records began, so I think that would suggest he's missed a trick. Financial experts say that his plans will push a further 1.3 million people into poverty. I think the thing to remember here is we throw around these numbers, we throw around these terms, we talk about this, but in real, tangible impact, people are getting poorer, wages are having less real-world impact, energy bills are going up. every cost is going up possible, while the amount we have to deal with is getting less, and people are going to suffer inordinately. And I don't think Rishi Sunak has done nearly enough to deal with that in real-time times.
OK, and Moya, just staying with you, front of the FT, P&O chief, he made quite a statement today, didn't he? He said he was sorry, but he also said that he did break the law and he'd do it again.
Well, he said he was sorry, and he said it was what he needed to do. And I think what is interesting about the P&O scandal is that it really shines a spotlight on the environment created for workers over the last decade. So the law that allowed Peter Hebblethwaite to fire 800 members of staff and rehire agency staff who are now being paid £5.50 an hour because it's legal in international waters, was actually brought in by Chris Grayling in 2018, which allows people to create an exemption where mass redundancies on ships registered overseas could take place, and the government wouldn't have to be notified. So you're seeing the sort of like the shortcuts that have created an environment where workers are penalised in order to create what Hebblethwaite called a modern company. I don't think a company that can fire 800 workers en masse, especially in the middle of a cost of living crisis, is a modern company or a company that we really want to represent industry in this country. OK, Annabel, just 30 seconds left. Let's get your thoughts. Front of the Yorkshire Post, concerns for safety after P&O sackings. I mean, he says that P&O would have been sunk. Sorry for no pun intended. But you know, he said this was his only option to keep the company going.
Well, certainly it's true that P&O has been struggling. It's lost £100 million in each of the past 2 years. I probably do believe Hebblethwaite when he says, you know, ultimately the alternative to sacking these people was not that they were going to be on the same contracts earning the same amount. It was that P&O would potentially go under. So, you know, obviously it was in a very difficult position, but that does not excuse the way that it has treated employees. It's handled the process with spectacular crassness. And I think there's going to be an enormous fallout. My concern is that we're moving towards a battle between P&O and the unions, with the government trying to be seen to be taking a tough line. I think we just need to remember those 800 workers who've been affected in all this.
Yeah, we really do. Really tough for them, of course. We've heard from them today. Thank you both, Moya and Annabel.